What's up? What's up? What do you do? Come on in. Ooh. Okay, come on in. Come on in the room while I struggle with the Instagram. Okay, come on in the room while I struggle with the gram. Okay, so we're gonna go where we left off. I'm not gonna waste too much time. Um, I hate that I always forget how to do this shit. Um, there's Robo Bear. What's up, fool? So yeah, I'm coming in for a special edition. Let me do this. What's up? What's up? We live. We're reading the medical apartheid. We're going to start where we left off next week so we could be ready for Wednesday and Thursday. I'm live on YouTube. Come and see me. I'll see you in a minute. Bring your ass to class. Bring your ass to class. How was your weekend? I hope it was good. Mine was as long as still going on as we speak. I took me an extra day and I was like, forget those fools. I need an extra day. And yeah, I needed an extra day. So I got some things done. I wish I would have got more done, but you know how it goes. So where do we get left? Where do we leave off? Oh yeah, a car landed in my yard. That's what happened. So it was fucking ill. Um, I don't know how to edit these, but I wish I could edit that out. But I posted it to the gram for those who cared, and then I took it down because I was just like, "Ooh, that's too close to my crib." So yeah, so we left off in the middle of chapter 9, on our way to chapter 10, where we were still talking about where they were injecting patients with plutonium, radium, and doing different experiments on people. Um, black people and how they were um, taking body parts and sorry, y'all, and experimenting, seeing how the skin would react to the plutonium and stuff like that. So just real ill sick shit. I mean, honestly, it's the same shit that goes on to this day. What is so interesting is how we talked about this in our other chapters. And um, what's coming to surface again is about the boy Kendrick Johnson, who was found in the gym at his high school. So it's interesting to me, you know, like what I say when we start the chapter, we read the chapter, see how it affects us in real time, how we could be proactive it just in our day-to-day lives with knowing this knowledge, how we could recognize things that are going on. And you know, we read in chapter 4 in the medical apartheid, which what we're reading right now. Um, you could get this book for $11 on Amazon. I had this for a long time, so don't judge me. But we're in chapter 9 right now. We're in the middle. Um, and Kendrick Johnson's story is has come back around. And in chapter 4, we read about the Georgia Medical College, or either the Medical College of Georgia. I might have it, you know, mixed up, but it's I think it's a medical uh, Georgia's Medical College or whatever. Well, what they found during research is under the school they found bones of patients that they did autopsies for. We also learned in chapter 4 and chapter 5 that some of these doctors would go to black enslaved grave sites and exhume the bodies and take them to that school for scientific research. Okay. Also, what we learned too in chapter 4 and 5 is other black, you know, historically black universities um, used bodies that they dug up from the graves. They even employed black men to exhume bodies, to do these autopsies and whatever the fuck weird shit that they was into. Um, we also learned that we learned a lot of things. So it's interesting that his story is coming back to surface. Uh, let's see here. So, um, yeah. So I want to go live on the gram too while I'm reading a little bit, and have these fools come on in so we can get this done. And hopefully we could get done early. It's not one of those super long chapters. Well, chapter 10 is kind of long, so let me not waste more time. Let's get back into this. Okay, here we go. To come and see me. I'll see you in a minute. Oh shit. Oh, I posted that to my to the Instagram. And I think I want to go live on this one because it's a little bit easier for me. Okay. So let's see. I'm always like an old person. So I hope they stick around. If you don't, it's on you, man. Okay. So let's get into it. So we left off on this paragraph here. Uh okay, let's see. Where did we leave off? Let me go back. Okay. So I don't recall that. So we're gonna go back some more. Oh, we learned about Operation Sunshine. I remember this. Where they put the radiation into the Quaker Oats oatmeal and sent it to the schools. Um, let's see here. Hold on. Okay, here we go. One Dickinson Institution, the federal school in Waltham, Massachusetts, added radioactive oatmeal to the menus of 30 orphans in a program sponsored by the AEC with the support of Quaker Oats Company. Old videotapes revealed that some of these Frenald boys were African American, but no record with racially identifiers were released. When victims died, government scientists obtained their bodies and autopsied them carefully, measuring the levels of radioactivity and biological damage. The mm, mm, mm. To enable large numbers of those grim assessments, at 15,000 bodies were exposed and collected for one project alone, Operation Sunshine. Until the mid 1980s, and without the knowledge of the patients or their next of kin. This program shipped the bodies and body parts of experiment victims to be dissected at headquarters in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Between 1960 and 1972, University of Cincinnati radiologist Eugene Sanger, MD, directed experimental high doses TBE on a total of 200 cancer patients were who of whom was 150 of them was black. The TBI method was dangerous, utilizing magnavolt X-rays, cobalt 60 or cesium 137 to administer the equivalent of 15,000 chest X-rays to the entire body. Patients typically receive from 100 to 400 rads. A rad is a unit of absorbed radiation with a complex definition, 150 rads, a common TBI dosage. is equivalent to 400 mammograms. 42% of the subjects given higher doses died within weeks, and some within days. However, a minority of the subjects received partial body radiation, which spared some portions of the body. When he proposed the experiments in hopes of funding and support from the Army Director of Nuclear Medicine in 1958, Sanger gave an experimental rationale explaining these studies are designed to obtain new information about the metabolic effects of the total body and partial body irradiation so as to have a better understanding of the acute and subacute effects of irradiation in the human. He deemed such information necessary to allow scientists to protect military personnel who might be irradiated during a war. The Army agreed to fund his experiments, but expressed doubts because doctors already knew there were radiosensitive cancers, which responded to radiation treatments, and I'm sorry, radio resistant cancers, which typically did not. By the 1940s, TBI was found effective against one radiosensitive cancer, but not against the localized radio-resistant cancers that Sanger studied. However, the subjects in Sanger's experiments, such as the 82 scientists, patients in Cincinnati General Hospital, 51 of them were Black, were told only that the TBI, that's the total body irradiation, right? Was a treatment for cancers. Among the catastrophic effects, these high doses destroyed the subject's bone marrow, and because bone marrow produces red blood cells, the total body irradiation proved quickly fatal to 1 out of every 4 subjects who died within about a month after suffering anemia, vomiting, and falling white blood cell counts, which left them open to a variety of infections. If one also counts patients who received partial body irradiation, 85 of the 111 people Sanger irradiated at Cincinnati General were Black. Total body experiments were also conducted by doctors at other Cincinnati hospitals, at Sloan Kettering Memorial Cancer Center in New York, at Texas Baylor University of Medicine, and the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, and the AEC Hospital in Oak Ridge. Only one of them, only one of the administering physicians was African American, Howard PMD, who vigorously denied the experiments had any racial component, which he got to know is a whole lie. You whole Black. Other radiation scientists assailed the description given by Sanger and his deputy, Dr. Clarence Lushbaugh of TBI, for radio-resistant cancer as therapy and insisted that experiments were too dangerous. Carl Morgan, who had considered Sanger a friend and had worked with Lushbaugh at Oak Ridge, said in 1994, I think the case of Clarence Lushbaugh's treatment of humans as guinea pigs and Eugene Sanger's at the Hospital of Cincinnati are some of the most terrible human studies I ever heard of, other than those that took place in Germany and a few in Japan during the war. Okay. Sanger at first insisted to the AC interviews in 1994 that written informed consent had been unnecessary for his experiments. Later, Cincinnati General produced consent signatures for the total body irradiation subjects, but the subject survivors questioned them. For example, Gloria Nelson, the granddaughter of subject Amelia Jackson, pointed out that a signed consent form was produced for her grandmother's file, but that Jackson had never learned to read or write, which wasn't unusual for that time. Dr. Eugene Sanger stated in congressional hearings that race, IQ, or socioeconomic standing were not selection factors. That's another lie. Officially, he explained that racial disparity by saying the experimental population merely reflected the racial component of the hospital populations where they were. But we learned in the other chapters that they would set up shop in Black neighborhoods to make it easier. As a matter of fact, what I was referring to earlier, where they call them night doctors. Those doctors, they would set up their shops in close to Black neighborhoods so they could have access. They even had a cadaver plug, and that's another reason why they would set up shop there. So what he's talking about is some whole bullshit, straight up. To come and see me. Okay, so yeah. To come and see me. I'm gonna need you to go away. Sorry, y'all, but I got to do this. To come and see. So yeah, we learned that that was some bullshit. Um, Dr. Eugene Sanger in congressional hearings that raised IQ. Okay, it's reflected in the hospital's population with it. Okay, his testimony, however, is contradicted by his research partner, Clarence Lushbaugh, who explained in 1995 that they chose slum patients because though these persons don't have any money and they're Black and they're poorly washed. These persons are available in the University of Cincinnati's to Dr. Sanger. I did I did review what he was doing, and I thought it was actually well done. In 1972, Sanger's total body irradiation projects ended when the DoD cut funding for them after the university had accrued more than $850,000. Sanger no longer referred to his work as investigative. He defended the experiments as cancer treatments and pointed out that such radiation treatments are used today for cancer treatment. They are used in extreme cases, but today's irradiations, including bone marrow transplants, bear little resemblance to the experiments carried out by Sanger. Today's procedures are therapeutic and reserved for those whose cancer is widely spread and non responsive to other methods. Because the irradiation destroys the bone marrow, marrow for transplant is required for reinfusion after the procedure. Unfortunately, it is more difficult to match the bone marrow of African Americans who tend to have a richer complement of antibodies than do most whites. This means that, like Marion Sims enslaved vesicovaginal fistula patient, that Black total body irradiation subjects experiences eventually enable cancer treatments from which Blacks are less likely to profit than are whites. Moreover, Sanger's patients did not have to die to provide such information. Researchers had known at least since 1950 that TBI destroys the bone marrow, but now they could calibrate the lethal doses more precisely. Okay, that's ill. Sanger, who was still a professor emeritus at the University of Cincinnati Medical School, as this book went to press, not want to reply to my telephone interview request through the U.S. Press Relations Office or to emails in which I asked him to discuss his work. But in this public statements, he defends his research as therapeutic and consensual. The Venerable American College of Radiology agreed, exonerating Sanger of wrongdoing on the basis of his denials and by ignoring the rules that govern experimentation during his tenure as a DoD researcher. The trajectory of Sanger's medical career did not falter, and he never faced criminal charges. Martha Stevens, a University of Cincinnati English professor, has written the treatment and comprehensive and unflinching history of the TBI test. In chapters describe the long, bitter fight for justice that finally culminated in $5 million settlement between 13 researchers and subject survivors. The agreement also stipulated that the university would erect a permanent memorial naming the victims, and in June 2000, it complied by installing a small, curiously dated plaque labeled dedicated to the patients of the radiation experimentation, 1973 to 1974, and listing the names of over 170 patients. The plaque was placed on the medical school grounds behind a dumpster and nestled between the kitchen and the parking lot. Sanger's use of mostly black subjects was a matter of convenience and culture, but other radiation experiments offered national rationales for deliberately targeting black subjects, like the scientific racists of centuries earlier. Investigators wished to demonstrate that blacks would respond differently to radiation's medical dangers. The design of such experiments required African American subjects. Many such experiments were conducted at the Medical College of Virginia, part of Virginia's Commonwealth University. Between 1949 and 1960, the MCV was home to the Secret Metabolic Laboratory, whose principal focus was the Army's preparation for massive nuclear casualties. MCV was chosen in part because it was heavily it was a uh, heavily research oriented school in the South, and the government had a particular interest in black subjects. For example, one MCV experiment sought to determine whether radiation inflicted different degrees of damage on the skin of black people than of that of whites. In 1947, Everett Idris Evans, at the behest of the Surgeon General of the Army, set up the nation's first civilian burn unit at MCV, funded by the Army. Evans planned to compare the burn injuries radiation caused in whites to those it caused in blacks. Some were charity patients who have been severely burned in accidents and whose experimental material constituted payment for their care by MCV staff. But MCV researchers deliberately caused third degree burns to the skin of other patients at Dooley, a charity hospital for black children, and at St. Philip, its sister hospital for Black adults. These hospitals eventually yielded 100 Black subjects a year, the ages of 6 months and 90 years for similar MCV burn experiments. Doctors used radiation emitted at graduated levels to measure the precise amount of energy necessary to induce specific levels of first to third degree burns. Investigators who produced the on the radiation burns on the arms of 44 whites at different area hospitals, at least in some cases. Scientists acknowledged that these were produced for investigational purposes. The doctors and radiation physicians used their data to calculate the number of people who would die at a specific distances from the nuclear bomb like that detonated over Hiroshima, approximately between 20 kilotons. Evans' team deduced that blacks suffered more intense burns than whites after the same exposure. And from this, researchers concluded that radiation burns from a nuclear event will injure blacks more severely than whites. Wow. Another experimental group of 460 Black and 770 white patients in the Medical College of Virginia was injected with a variety of radioactive substances, including phosphorus 32, without their consent. Blacks made up 37% of these experimental subjects. nearly four times the representation in the population. The AEC, who sponsored 15 other radiation studies on 300 Black patients at New Orleans Charity Hospital. The studies were conducted by Tulane University physicians. The most toxic of these experiments involved dispensing mercury in yet another study of desperate racial reactions to radiation. 22 Black patients were made to swallow radioactive mercury in order to calibrate its symptoms and the length of time the body took to excrete the toxic metal. Mm-mm. That made my ear itch. And the length of time the body took to excrete the toxic metal. In another Tulane experiment, doctors surreptitiously, oh, I'm saying that wrong. Yeah, surreptitiously placed radioactive mercury into the open sores that remained just after they had removed blisters from a dozen colored and three white patients in order to judge the metal effects on the healing times. They amassed no clinically meaningful data. So they was just doing shit. Despite the MCV findings that Blacks were more vulnerable to radiation burn damage, and a logical belief persisted among doctors and radiologic technicians that African Americans could tolerate I'm sorry, y'all, what the hell is that? Increased amounts of radiation that could whites ill effect, like the belief that Blacks better tolerate pain than whites do. This stubborn myth gave license to conduct painful and dangerous experimental radiation practices. In 1968, consumer activist Ralph Nader complained to the Washington Post about the nationwide practice of giving Negroes 25 to 30% stronger X ray doses than whites. G.J. Talton, a professor at cardiology at the predominantly Black Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, swiftly dismissed the claim as a fantastic charge. But California radiologic technicians conducted a 1966 survey that revealed 72% of the state X ray technicians had opted on their own initiative to administer these higher X ray exposures to Blacks because of their vague beliefs that African Americans were physiologically different. Their bones are harder and denser, their skin is darker, their flesh is tougher. Physicians for the Public Health Service and American College of Radiology denied ever issuing such advisories to the two doctors, but it was technicians, not doctors, who were making the experimental adjustments without citing their actions in the official medical records. So these motherfuckers was just so this wasn't in some cases doctors' orders. This was the technicians while you're waiting for the doctor to come through. While you're waiting for the doctor to come through, these technicians are giving harsh ass exposure on people's chests. And I'm imagining if they're coming through with some type of lung problem or something like that, then they're giving them higher doses of x rays because they think our bones are denser. And I think that's a lot of the reasons why they would do a bunch of experiments on us in the first place. As we learned in the other chapters, especially the first chapter, chapter 1 and 2, where they was doing the experiments where Dr. Miriam Sims was doing. That girl went through like 40 surgeries, and how they would purposely get women addicted to morphine so they could perform the surgeries on their vagina. Um, where did I leave off? Dental. who were making experiments. Also, despite the denials, physicians were being taught to administer higher than indicated radiation doses to blacks. For example, the 1963 edition of X-ray Technology by Charles L. Something, with his weird ass name, Don Q. Paris, a standard textbook, contained a chart recommendation that the standard radiation doses should be increased for Negro X-ray patients. In 1968, a study commissioned by Bernard Goldman, director of New York State Bureau of X-ray, also found that a significant portion of technicians had exposed blacks to higher radiation doses than whites, leading the New York State Health Department to specifically prohibit the practice. There were many other racially mediated radiation experiments. For example, the AEC irradiated 235 African American newborns in between 1953 and 1954 in various hospitals across the country, but released radiation records giving very sparse details. However, the biophysics professor Lester Van Middlesworth injected each of the black newborns with 1 to 5 microcuries of radioactive iodine, iodine 132. In 1940, programs at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Records also revealed that 6 of the 7 infants injected at John Gaston Hospital, a now defunct public hospital in Memphis, were also black, and their doctors measured their uptake of iodine, which I'm allergic to, thank God, which targets the thyroid gland. 24 hours later, they could also learn more about the gland functions in infants. Today, radioactive tracers are used for therapeutic or screening purposes in smaller, safer amounts. No one should avoid such tests, which trade a low radiation risk for significant health benefits. So that's generally, but these, I'll read the rest, but these were not therapeutic injections as the risks were unjustifiable. So she's referring to if you need to get that like a CAT scan or no, no, I'm not high as a mug. This is what my face looks like. A lot of people think that and say that, but this is what I look like. So yeah, I don't need Bud to make my eyes look chinky. Um, you can watch all my videos. This is what I look like. So sorry to disappoint. You can come on over to my Instagram and look at all my pictures. This is just my face. Maybe it's that Chinese my grandfather. But anyway, the experimental use of radiation to harm and to stigmatize African Americans is not entirely relegated to, okay, let's see, when I get introduced. Damn, are you on here just looking at how cute I am? Are you on here paying attention to the words that are coming out of my mouth? And then I could tell you're not paying attention. Well, you're gone anyway, but I could tell you're not paying attention because you're throwing all these compliments. What am I supposed to be like, ooh la la? And while I'm reading, are you listening to what I'm reading? And then you ended by going, you're high as a mug. That's what you got to say to me? Message. The experimental use of radiation to harm and to stigmatize African Americans is not entirely relegated to the distant past. In 1978, scientists revisited an experiment that had not been conducted between 1940 and 1959 at New York University Hospital. There, scientists irradiated the scalps of 200. Wait. They radiated the scalps of 2,500 children, 625 of them black, to treat for their tinea capitis or ringworm without notification to their parents. Children were taken from classrooms for the x ray treatment, and their burns and side effects were carefully assessed, raising the question whether X ray treatments were chiefly experimental rather than therapeutic in nature. Blacks made up 9.8% of the US population in 1940. So these children represented 2.5 times their rate in population. Wow. Um, Between 1910 and 1959, let me get off here real quick. Yo, don't come on to my live on some stupid stuff. I know I'm a beautiful lady. It could be distracting sometimes to some people who are interested in a person that looks like me. But like, don't come over here with that bullshit if you're not gonna be like paying attention to what I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like when I do my real talking girly stuff, maybe you could come over there and put them compliments there, but I'm reading the motherfucking medical apartheid. So if you're not coming in the class paying attention, or you're not coming in here like on point, then you could just bounce yourself the fuck out of here. Okay? Or you could be blocked. You know what I'm saying? So I didn't appreciate that, even though what he was saying was very nice to me. And I appreciate the compliment, but don't come on here talking about some, oh, you hide in a mug. No, boo, this is what my face look like with or without lashes. Okay, this is what I look like. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. And these are my eyes. This is how they are. So, and just don't disrespect. Anyway, 1940, 1959. Where the hell? Oh, here we go. At several sites, including the New York University Hospital, there are scientists. Okay, so no, we were there. We read that part already. Between 1910 and 1959, before effective topical medications were developed, 200,000 children around the world received about 175 rats each for treatment of ringworm. By 1940, when the NYU irradiated um, children, researchers had known for over 25 years that this level of radiation was extremely dangerous, and the standard treatment for ringworm was not irradiation but ultraviolet light or topical chemotherapy. In 1978, the American Journal of Public Health published an article in which NYU researchers assessed the psychiatric results of radiation had on developing brains of 177 of the subjects. They administered the Minnesota multifaceted personality inventory. I never heard of that before. To 118 whites and 59 blacks. Um, NYU had included in the experiment a control group of 1,800 children who had been treated with chemotherapy, 450 of whom, or 25%, were black. Researchers found more psychological symptoms and deviant personality scores among the adult whites who had been treated by the irradiation than among those who had been treated with topical medication symptoms than medically treated blacks. And this suggested to them that the radiation levels that could cause brain damage in whites did not affect blacks. Some researchers have suggested brain insults at birth. I'm sorry. suggested insults at birth have relatively less impact among blacks on the risk of subsequent neurophysiatric disorders than among whites, the article stated. This conclusion recalls both the basis belief that higher doses of radiation were needed in blacks to produce the same effects as in whites, and the previously discussed belief that some disorders, whereas syphilis and tuberculosis affects blacks in a manner that spares their nervous systems and brains. However, investigators admitted to serious flaws in their experimental design. The MMPI is ethnically biased and less sensitive in discerning pathology among African Americans. Also, researchers tested fewer than 10% of the original subjects, and this small sample size may have also distributed the results. Mm-mm. In more cases than not, the victims are African Americans. You're dealing with the majority of people of African American descent. My mother thinks it's a grand scale plan, and since Elmerine Whitfield Bell, and that's the daughter of Elmer, um, not Elmer Cade, Elmer Allen, who had his leg amputated, and they used that limb to experiment the effects of plutonium on his leg. Um, is she right for some radiation research programs? The racial breakdown has been obscured by the engineered atmosphere of the seat and secrecy. Even patients' names are missing, lost forever with the case records. While I'm sorry, y'all, all extant data indicates that a higher number of African Americans than whites were used in many clandestine radiation experiments. As mentioned earlier, subject advocate E. Cooper Brown of the National Committee for Radiation Victims estimated that 3 of every 5 radiation victims were people of color. 75% of these subjects in the University of Cincinnati irradiation experiments were African American. But the real significance in the fact that African Americans were typically used in significantly greater proportions than the 10 to 12% of the population they have constituted. In 1993, DOE Secretary Hazel O'Leary, the first African American to hold that position, displayed refreshing candor as she, I'm sorry, y'all, hold on. Mm-mm. As she reacted to the graphic press allegations of the government's experimentation on its own citizens. She admitted that the agency's guilt and ordered the selective declassification of vital nuclear information. In December 1993, she ordered the opening of all DOE records of the 435 human radiation experiments. That's right. And the experiments conducted between 1944 and the 1990s. Damn. O'Leary's investigation ushered in a new atmosphere of openness to replace decades of Machiavellian Cold War secretiveness, as she explained. As she explained, we've learned that openness helps to bring a corrective to government and quickly. She ordered 800 or 665 cubic feet of original declassified documents and investigation results stored in the National Archives that mounted on the DOE websites. This is the sort of forthrighteousness that would have prevented the investigative failures of the Tuskegee Ad Hoc Committee. On January 15th, 1994, President Clinton created an advisory committee on human radiation experiments to investigate fully the genesis of these experiments and to judge them. The committee was also charged with making sure that these abuses would never be repeated. Clinton also issued an apology on October 1995, but few seem to know this. It was drowned out by the din that accompanied the O.J. Simpson verdict, which was announced a few hours later. Clinton's brief remarks did not mention any racial component of the studies. The revelation of the committee facilitated civil lawsuits brought against the government and the universities by hundreds of victims and survivors. Some cases have been successful, such as those mounted by the chiefly Black victims of the Cincinnati TBI experiments. That's the total body irradiation. That's when they put the radiation all over your body. And the PBI is partial, so they'll select partial parts of your body and expose that body part to radiation. Others are still being contested. However, the ACHRE chose to interview the researchers and publish the resultant oral histories instead of charging them with crimes. None of the physicians conducting the radiation experiments were never placed on trial. The radiation experiments captured the moment when an important group of physician scientists ceased to re- ceased to view themselves as healers and benefactors first, with disastrous results for their victims and for American medicine. For African Americans, the full cost and lost health and lost trust are still being reckoned, and it's still fucked up to this day. Even today, events occasionally remind us that racism and radiation experimentation remain, remain linked at locations such as the Savannah River site. Locals call it simply the SRS, located by the outside Aiken, South Carolina, located just outside Aiken, South Carolina, owned by the DOE and managed by South Carolina's Westinghouse Savannah River Company. This high tech manufacturing facility once produced tritium and plutonium 239 for nuclear weapons. Now that the Cold War has abated, it processes nuclear waste. Approximately 2,800 of the SRS's 14,000 employees are Black. And by 2002, they have filed at least 22 lawsuits. These complained that Black employees were denied promotions, were subjected to racial graffiti. Oh, wow. Found nooses hanging in their lockers and were subjected to higher radiation levels than were whites. We have disciplined employees, including terminating an employee for incidents involving nooses. And this is what the president of the company said, that he terminated those fools. And this was confirmed for the Augusta Chronicle in 2002. In 1997, the Department of Labor ordered Westinghouse to compensate seven Black SRS workers. But even worse, Blacks complained that they were relegated to high radiation areas of the plant, dubbed the coon areas. Wow. They were dubbed the coon areas by the whites. James Ruttenberg of the University of Colorado School of Medicine assessed employee radiation readings between 1991 and 1998 using their domestic individual radiation counters. His findings corroborated with these workers' claims. And here's I guess this is a quote from him. When all annual dose measurements are grouped by race, the doses for Blacks were higher than those for whites in all dose categories. The annual penetrating doses for Blacks are about 1.8 times as high as the doses for whites. The analysis supports The analyses support the hypothesis that these differences are due to job placement practices that put blacks in jobs that have higher radiation exposures than whites. Yet, their requests for the transfer to safer areas have been denied. Jimmy Walker, for example, inhaled plutonium at the plant in 1977. This drove his exposure beyond the permitted lifetime dose of, of 50 rims. A rims a rim is a measure of radiation dose, essentially a rad that is adjusted for its biological effect. In 2002, after multiple permanent transfer requests were ignored, his radiation levels soared to more than 80 rams, nearly twice the permitted lifetime exposure, and he retired at the age of 48 in poor health. The exposures also placed Walker at risk of becoming an experimental subject. At a 2002 checkup, a company doctor pressed into Walker's hands and a leaflet, I'm sorry, pressed into Walker's hands a leaflet suggesting he donate his body to a radiation research project at Washington State University. In return, his family would receive $500. $500. I feel betrayed by the company. This is him. I feel betrayed by the company, by the government, Walker told London's independent newspaper in 2002. Now they have admitted the radiation causes cancer. All the time they were they were telling me there was nothing to worry about. By 2002, the DOE had paid out 25 million to blackers in 62 settlements, but the company admits to no wrongdoing. Wow. African American radiation victims are neither silent nor passive. Elmer Allen's daughter, Elmerine Whitfield Bell, is an activist who challenges abusive experimentation and refuses to let the memory of her father and other radiation victims fade from memory with the headlines. What I really want to come from this, Bell says, is some type of coalition of victims and survivors of radiation treatments and experiments so that we could get together and really speak to the issue on a national and international basis. I'm determined that as long as I breathe, I will address the issue of radiation and how to eradicate this sort of experimentation from the earth. It will always be used against poor folk. We have to do something. So this is me just doing my part. So that's the end of chapter 9. Come on over to YouTube, y'all, on the gram, and you'll have to get with chapter 10 over there, okay? See you in a minute. So we headed into chapter 10. Y'all might want to get your tissue boxes ready because if it's the one that I think it is, then yeah, you might want to get your tissues because it's about to get real. And then I can get me something to drink. I got my little drink right here. And we're gonna get right into it. Okay, we're gonna get right into it. Just give me 1 minute to finish posting this. Okay, so chapter 10. Tonight we are reading chapter 10 and we'll continue with chapter 11 on Wednesday. Now that we have finally caught up, I hope I see you over on YouTube. All right, so let's get into chapter 10 so we can get this ready. And this is called Cage Subjects Research on Black Prisoners. I'm not ready. Oh, I learned about this one though. Was it in the Carolinas? Well, there was this prison where they were doing experiments on their skin trying different products on their skin without their permission, or giving them like a few cents a day for their participation in the experiment. Okay. Is it dark yet? Not yet. I couldn't see. That's why I was hella long. So it's 8 o'clock. We on good time. All right. Hopefully I can get this done in an hour or within the hour. Okay. Okay. Now here's a quote from Pertinax, British Medical Journal, January 1963. Let me get this crease out of here because I need one of them reading lights. Okay, that helped the teach though. I am disturbed that the World Medical Association is now hedging on the clause about not using criminals as experimental material. The American influence has been at work on its suspension. One of the nicest American scientists I know was heard to say, criminals in our penitentiaries are fine experimental material and much cheaper than chimpanzees. Okay, so that's what they think. That's fucking ill. How somebody could say some shit like that. Okay, sorry, I gotta grease it up. My lips are so chapped out the clear blue sky. It was just that day. One day I was outside and I got blasted. Anyways, on a brightly promising early spring day in 2004, Jesse Williams and I shared a brunch in a Philadelphia seafood house splashed with bright jewel-like colors against a black drop, a backdrop of sunny seascapes and murmuring, beseated, besweeted executives. Williams affably recited his resume, detailing the grim expertise in pain and survival he had accrued during his 4 decades imprisoned in Holmesburg Prison. That's the one I'm talking about, in Holmesburg prison systems. But see, if you go on YouTube, they don't really talk about the Black experience too much in depth, but they do have some news clips in case that you just wanted to look into it. Um, during his 4 decades in prison in the Holmesburg prison system. The Scientific Kingdom of University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Dr. Albert M. Kligman. I'm going to go into that. I don't got it nearby, so I'm not. Williams told the audience of being burned by radiation and sulfuric acid, of immersing his arms in chemicals that had tanned his skin like leather, and of how physicians and technicians had rubbed acid into his scrotum until the skin fell away, all for $3 a session. Researchers, oh my God, that's so gross. Let me read that again. Williams told the audience of being burned by radiation and sulfuric acid, of immersing his arms in chemicals that had tanned his skin like leather, and of how physicians and technicians had rubbed acid into his scrotum until the skin fell away. All for $3 a session. Researchers had cut his armpits to study the glands and had laced his back with scars in an attempt to induce the disfiguring ropey overgrowths called keloids. Not only patches of poison oak and ivy, but also cadaveric tissue had been implanted on his back, and he had inhaled vapors infused with influenza and other viruses. Patch tests of various harsh chemicals and ointments had left a checkerboard of rectangular scars on his back. Detergents whose names he did not know had removed his hair, braided his scalp. Oh my God. I'm sorry, that's nasty. Williams had offered himself up for as many as 12 experiments at once, bringing him from $30 to $50 for each multi session research study. Yet he said, we were never told what was going on. We never had witnesses or a receipt for anything we signed. Before the audience, Williams had been practiced and powerful. But I share but I share with you a more subdued man, one invested with subtle but direct manner, and who spoke with complete candor about by a violent past that included jail stints for robbery and assault. I done it all the time. I done it all, he admitted. Oh my God, I can't take this call right now. I'm live, yo. He admitted quietly. Okay, I've done it all, he admitted quietly. He is now a Christian and spoke sadly of the many former inmates who died in broken health and of his concern for another seriously ill subject. Only after being prodded to speak of his own plight did he lament his myriad. Sorry, I got distracted by the call. Okay. Only plight did he lament his myriad physical problems, from leg ulcers to mental changes to chronic skin problems, which he ascribed to the testing. The doctors can't tell me what it is. They don't know what I was tested with. Williams confided his regret of never having achieved the education he desperately wanted, and he voiced ambivalence about displaying his scars, physical and mental, for strangers in order to gain support for an inmate's lawsuit. I feel I'm on display in a zoo sometimes. He sat back, sighed softly. No one should ever have to go through what we went through. Not again. Not in a civilized country. Oh my God. When Robert Boyle, the 17th century father of chemistry, mused upon feasibility of scientific research with humans, he proposed trail may be made on some genuine human bodies, especially those of malefactors, for the testing of inoculation practices to the use of cadavers for dissection and display. The medical community has turned to jail inmates first when it sought experimental subjects. Even a 1910 editorial in the Black Physician's Chief publication, the fledgling journal of the National Medical Association, proposed that prisoners were the appropriate medical research subject. The GNMA suggested that prisoners might simultaneously expiate their debt to society and protect others, especially African Americans, by substituting for them as unwilling research subjects. Black physicians wish to pursue research while protecting their African American patients, and the use of I'm sorry, and the use of prisoners was an alternative in which black and white could be comfortable. It's hard to see. I ain't got the sun to back me up no more. Uh, but why are prisoners such universally di- why can't I read right now? I'm distracted. But why are prisoners such universally desirable subjects for medical research? Boyle was only adhering to the inexorable logic of his profession when he suggested that medical experimentation was most acceptable when practiced upon prisoners. In his time, prisoners were vulnerable, stigmatized, and expendable. They tended to be poor and uneducated. They were likely to belong to despised and powerless minority groups. They had already lost more important civil rights, and their crimes or alleged crimes were made them feared and hated. They were barred from assuming any useful role in society, which in turn begrudged them even the sparsest expenditures for their own room and board, for which some 18th century prisoners were billed. Few had families or much support from the family they had. In Boyle's time in our own town, prisoners were viewed as dangerous parasites who would not be missed should something happen to them. Boyle's shoe suggestion has even been shared by prisoners as some clamor for inclusion in medical investigations for reasons that are examined hereafter. But in our time, there has been another motivation. Prisoners are ideal subjects for phase one trials. Federal regulations dictate that modern human medical experiments consist of at least three formal phases. Highly simplified, these are phase one, which asks, how safe is the drug? Phase two, which continues evaluating safety while also seeking to determine how effective is the drug. And if the treatment seems safe and effective, the trial proceeds to phase three, which compares the treatment to the standard treatment, using subject treated with investigative therapy and control of and a control group treated with the current standard of care, if one exists. If not, the control group may be given a placebo and inert sham treatment to enable comparison with the new therapy. Phase one trials use healthy volunteers to test the safety in treatment, um, looking for side effects and the best mode of administration. Because they are the first human tests, phase one trials carry a higher risk of problems such as side effects than do other trials. For this reason, companies prefer phase one trials to take place in institutions where subjects can be carefully monitored and are unlikely to be lost to follow up. If serious problems develop, the researchers want to know. The researchers want to know. Prisoners fit the bill nicely. Around 1963, Robert Batterman, MD, an expert in pharmaceutical experimentation, said phase one is very big in prison. The FDA prefers phase one to be on an inpatient basis, the only place available for large scale toxicity studies in prison. He also added, I'm sorry, I just had a thought. The vast majority of new drugs, more than 90%, never get into medical practice. They prove too toxic and fall by the wayside in phase two. That Jesse Williams and thousands of his fellow incarcerated research subjects were African American is no incident. African Americans have always been dramatically overrepresented in jails and prisons. So, as any discussion of U.S. inmates is closely bound up with race, and medical experimentation behind bars is no exception. Some influential white scientists, such as Italian physician Cesar Lombroso, whose theories were discussed in Chapter 3, did not distinguish blacks and criminals. In 1911, Lombroso observed there exists a group of criminals born for evil against whom all social cures break as though against a rock, a fact which compels us to eliminate them completely, even if by death. This group consisted of men who were inherently, immutably evil because of their deranged physiology. They were also, in his view, more likely to be black than white. When Lombroso, hold on, y'all. You know what I mean? Like when Lombroso sought to illustrate his theories of a criminal man, he unhesitatingly chose an African society, the Dinka of the Upper Nile, as the perfect example of born savage criminals. The Dinka were no more bellicose than any other societies on the continent, but their dark skin was enough for them to qualify for this distinction. Among the physical stigmata that conclusively signaled their criminal nature were dark skin and inability to blush. Inability inability to blush has always been considered the accompaniment of crime and shamelessness. Blushing is a very rare among idiots and savages. Well, because they don't turn pink. Medical theories of criminality are important because medicine long claimed special provenance over criminality. The very frequent reference to a prison as a site of rehabilitation and treatment is s- is the norm of modern penology. Illegal behavior was medicalized in an 1870 statement of the Congress of American Prison Association. And this is their quote: "A criminal is a man who suffered under a disease evinced by oh my God, why can't I read right now? Evinced by the perpetration of a crime, who may reasonably be held to be under the dominion of such disease until his conflict has afforded very strong presumption not only that he is free from its immediate influence, but the chances of its reoccurrence have become exceedingly remote." I mean, just say you're going to hold them in jail till they won't do it no more. Damn. Until you feel they won't do it no more. Why they got to add all that extra shit? Okay, Dr. Carl Menninger, often called the Dean of American Psychiatry, was a psychoanalyst, Harvard professor and scion of the dynasty of psychiatrics who founded the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. His lectures and readable books helped bring mental disorders out of the dark closet of shame and secrecy in which they had languished until the mid 20th century. He also had a special sympathy for prisoners, but he attributed criminal behavior not to the constitutional evil of Lombroso's conscience deprived criminal man, but to limit but to a limited psyche. The spasms and struggles of a submarginal human being trying to make it in our complex society with inadequate equipment. African American behavior has long been path. Oh my gosh, why can't I read right now? African American behavior has long been pathologized. Why can I say it? In a similar has been passed down in a similar manner. Okay, in fact, the imaginary black diseases dreamt up by the American School of Ethology are psychiatric disorders with strong forensic biases. As described in Chapter 1, they ascribed illegal behavior as well as pathological behavior to blacks. And the medicine Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright prescribed was punishment by whips or hard labor. I remember that. I remember that shit. Hey, what's up, girl? 20th century corrections personnel perpetuated this medical pathology. Oh my God. Why can I say this? The passing down of bad behavior, okay, by making references to the borderline personality disorders, antisocial personalities, and sociopaths within their walls who had never been diagnosed by a medical professional. San Quentin prison psychiatric Dr. Harvey Paulson, for example, discussed how in the 1950s staff recklessly made diagnoses of inmates from a Rorschach test, a then popular diagnostic tool that involved interpreting responses to ink dark patterns. My sense of the situation is that adult authority used the test for rationalizations for what they already decided based upon their own intuition. Okay, dark days at Holmesburg Prison. Okay, in 1998, Alan Hornblum published Acres of Skin, which documents the abusive experimentation conducted at Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison Complex by Dr. Albert Kligman between the 1950s and 1970s. Most of this research was practiced upon African American men. And if you look online, it's not that much information about the black men though. Oh, not only that, but they were used for the worst and most dangerous experiments. Kligman, a dermatologist, was initially invited to Holmesburg Prison in 1951 to treat an outbreak of athlete's foot, but his initial reaction to Holmesburg was far from therapeutic and gave Hornblum's book its title. All I saw before my eyes were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. This is the quote from Klingsman, okay? So now you can already tell off top he's a sick motherfucker. Um, Soon Klingsman was inducing foot fungus, not treating it because he saw the opportunity to conduct a lucrative experiment upon thousands of captive bodies for at least 33 major pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies such as Johnson and Johnson, Merck, Helena Rubinstein, and DuPont. Oh, wow. During World War II, prisoners had been commonly used as research subjects, and after the war, the United States was the only nation in the world continuing to legally use prisoners in clinical trials. Federal pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies mon- uh, money catalyzed a 30-year boom in research with prisoners. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Klingman gained exclusive experimental use of inmate bodies, testing 153 experimental drugs between 1962 and 1966 alone. 75% of Holmberg's inmate population, including Jesse Williams, were administered cosmetics, powders, shampoos that cause baldness, extensive scarring, and permanent skin and nail injury. Fingernails were removed or deformed by punching biopsies in which a physician employs a special forceps or a biopsy punch to obtain a full thickness circulation sample of the skin or nail. The subject's backs were so covered by flayed, discolored, and scarred skin from various patch tests of chemicals that the distinctive checkerboard or striped skin was a sure tip off that the man was an ex con. If you ever saw guys on the beach, you would know they were where the hell they've been, explained former guard Joseph Day. A lifer in his 80s complained of a back all marked up with bad blackheads and scars. After a quarter century of patch tests, that first test nearly killed me. It was so painful, I nearly went through the wall. But he eventually participated in more than 50 tests during a 40-month stint in a county jail for which he earned several $1,000s. Wow, that's oh. When Kleeman used prisoners to devise an anti acne medication written in A, it made him a millionaire. Jailed subjects were also inoculated with herpes, vaccinia, and a wart virus and were exposed to staph and monilia. Their skin was exposed to everything from radioisotopes to temperature extremes. Dow Chemical Company also paid Klingman to test dioxin in a suspected carcinogen, which he applied to the skin of 70 prisoners, mostly black. He also inoculated men with syphilis, gonorrhea, malaria, and amoebic dysentery. Each participant earned anywhere from $10 to $700, especially upon the length, danger, and unpleasantness of the research. That still made enough money though. Like $700, like. But in fall of 1965, the FDA became alarmed when the Journal of the American Medical Association published Klingman's article based on research in which he covered inmates' torsos with the banned substance dimethyl dimethyl sulfoxide, DSMO. I know that's bad because we learned about that in hair school. An oily industrial solvent. The FDA began scrutinizing his work, and his documents cite irregularities as falsification of reports. And that's the FDA's quote. Alarm over Klingman's extremely large numbers of investigations and concern that he was dabbling in areas far removed from his specialty, dermatology. FDA documents also condemned Klingman's practice of routinely enrolling inmates in multiple studies simultaneously, which multiplied their health risks and clouded the source of any adverse effects. What's more, Klingman's Klingman's record keeping discrepancies were rife. He, like many other prison investigators, destroyed or lost medical files. This allowed them to claim later, among other things, that African Americans were not disproportionately represented in abusive procedures. On July 19th, the FDA removed Klingman from its list of approved researchers and notified sponsors that he no longer was eligible to perform drug testing, but just a month later, the FDA restored his privileges. Well, the FDA is concerned that Klingman was venturing too far afield of dermatology. His area of expertise was certainly warranted. He began performing chemical warfare tests for the Army and the CIA. What? Using psychotropic agents. Perhaps the most harrowing experimental accounts are those of CIA mind control experiments in which psychoactive substances, including excuse me, Schedule II drugs, those with high abuse risk, were administered to inmates as part of the MK Ultra program, a CIA research program. Damn, see, I don't be lying. I don't be lying. I don't be lying. A CIA research program conducted from 1953 through the 1970s to produce the perfect truth drug for interrogating Soviet intelligence operatives. According to Kliegman's own studies or statements, he was operating essentially unregulated and with inmates who participated because they had been told neither the nature of the test nor the risk that they were taking. In 1972, enthused, it was before the authorities knew I was conducting various studies on prisoner volunteers. Things were simple then. Informed consent was unheard of. No one asked me what I was doing. It was a wonderful time. I told you these motherfuckers are weirdos. The government tests were conducted from 3 trailers on the prison grounds. Some inmates gave tests a wide berth because it was rumored they involved LSD and drove men crazy. But others eventually entered them, drawn by the money, which was much more than was than what was paid for the skin test. Half of these subjects reported frightening hallucinations that lasted for days, where prisoners say that they were never given consent forms or told that the drugs were being given. Edward Anthony, a black Holmesburg inmate during the mid 1960s, said that after he suffered rashes from the skin test, he moved on to more lucrative army experiments. I don't remember much of what happened after I was given the injection, but I know once it wore off, I was a different person than before. I used to be a mild mannered person, but now I have drastic mood swings and have trouble controlling my temper. Jesse Williams gives similar accounts of his times in the trailer. I used to be into non confrontational crimes, burglary, stealing cars, but after the mind test, I was a different person, more confrontational. I would go to bars actively seeking trouble. I was never like this before. And some drugs cause temporary paralysis or helplessness, or even place the subject into a canatotic state for which he could neither communicate nor react to his surroundings. Others cause prolonged nausea, and still others, such as the drugs Williams and Anthony took, provoke long term violent behavior. We still cannot know which drugs the men were given because they were investigational and identified only by number. The test results are classified, but the Army acknowledges that it conducted such experiments at Holmesburg. Wow. Wow. There are limited Army involvement with the University of Pennsylvania many years ago, admitted Lieutenant Colonel Bill Wilchan, a Pentagon spokesman. The Army does not engage in this type of medical research today. In 1973 congressional hearing on human experimentation, the Senate Labor and Public Welfare Committee's Health Subcommittee heard testimony from former Holmesburg inmates Leodis Jones and Alan Lawson, who charged the university was deceptive in the handling of consent and procedures and informing inmates of possible risks. In January 1974, the Philadelphia Prison System's Board of Trustees terminated the program. It's about goddamn time. But you know they came up with some other ill shit. Get some more this Carmex on. 24 years later, when Acres of Skin was published, many former subjects realized for the first time that they had rights as experimental subjects and could sue the University of Pennsylvania, Kligman's home institution, despite the indemnification waivers that some had signed. In September 2000, 298 former Holmesburg prisoners filed a class action lawsuit against the university. Johnson and Johnson, Dow Chemical Company, Doc Kligman and his company, Ivy Research Labs, and the city of Philadelphia. But the years and the experiments had taken their physical toll. Most subjects are dead, and the survivors now are in their 50s and 60s, suffer from skin and nail problems, breathing difficulties, cancers, and stubborn, sometimes unidentified infections. 70 former inmates have joined a community assistance for prisoners to pursue legal redress. Heartened by the 2.4 mil, damn, heartened by the 2.4 million settlement awarded in 2000 to Washington State prison inmates whose testicles have been cut and irradiated between 1963 and 1973. Oh my God. But the Holmesburg suit had been stemmed by the statute of limitations. Oh, wow, that sucks. The University of Pennsylvania insists that its research was ethical because the inmates gave informed consent. It wasn't informed, though. They're lying. They signed waivers and took payment. Senior Vice Dean Richard Tanman, MD, of the University Medical Center, contends that because human research was widely accepted at the time of Holmesburg experiments, Kligman was not considered to be in violation of any Hippocratic ideals. The hospital offered the men free evaluations and treatment. Should his doctors find a casual relationship between the experiments and their current ailments? Jesse Williams responded, "We don't trust them. How can we?" Kleeman doesn't respond to interview requests, but he defended his work in a prepared 1997 statement. And this is his quote: "To the best of my knowledge, the result of those experimentations advanced our knowledge of the pathogenesis of skin disease, and no long-term harm was done to any person who voluntarily participated in the research program." Wow. So he just didn't give a fuck, okay? Holmesburg was no anomaly. In 1952, Chester M. Southam of the Sloan Kettering Institute injected at least 396 inmates at Ohio State Prison, more than 180 of them black, with live, oh my God, with live human cancer cells. Southam said he wished to study the process by which healthy bodies neutralize and killed off cancer cells. One of the sponsors for Southam's research was the National Institutes of Health, which also sponsored the PHS syphilis study at Tuskegee. Southam inmates ensured that inmates that the experiments were perfectly safe because any cancer that took would spread slowly and could be removed surgically. But that's what he said. We know that ain't what really happened. Hold on, let's find out. Let me stretch. Okay. Mm-mm, mm-mm, mm-mm. That's terrible. Inmates also were in flawed blood. Inmates were also used in flawed blood plasma trials testing high volume plasma pheresis transfusions utilizing large amounts of plasma. I said plasma, blood plasma trials, high volume plasma pheresis. So this is some sort of transfusion utilizing large amounts of plasma. Between 1967 and 1969, throughout the state of Alabama. The study was managed by Dr. Austin R. Stowe, a Kilby Draper and McAllister prisons were very. According to the New York Times, there was also no informed consent and no accurate records were kept. So no racial backgrounds of his subjects were available. The record keeping and the management of their study were so poor that many men sickened and died not from experimental risks, but from simple poor hygiene and from plasma transfusions of the wrong blood type. Oh my God. Sterile tech Sterile technique was all but ignored by the poorly trained technicians in the laboratory, where blood and fluids pulled on the floors and stained every available surface was filthy. Mm, mm, mm. As a result, 28% of the subjects developed hepatitis, in contrast to only 1% of the inmates who were not subjects. Dr. Stowe was expelled several times from hospitals and prisons after his subjects sickened and died from $2 million in profits. In other prisons, excuse me, in other prisons across the nation, hundreds of black and white inmates were subjected to flash burns, burns caused by excessive skin or corneal exposure to heat radiation, rather than the direct application of heated tools. Burns were specifically inflicted upon African Americans at sites such as the cornea of the eyes, where they sometimes led to permanent vision problems, forearms, and backs, because scientists wished to learn how thermal radiation affected darker skins as opposed to white skin. Some of these experiments duplicated the experiments conducted by the Medical College of Virginia, which were described in Chapter 9. Often under the guise of treatment, psychiatric experimentation with imprisoned Black with African Americans has spanned the poles of barbarity and sophisticated personality destruction. In the 1950s, Tulane University psychiatrist Dr. Robert Heath selected Black prisoners specifically for use in psychosurgery experiments. These involve implanting electrodes into inmates' brains to repeatedly stimulate their pleasure sensors. Wow. Also conducted CIA funded. That's the shit that they did in the MK Ultra trials. They would implant electrodes into like animals and bulls, and they would create these remote controls where they could physically control them. It's a very, very real thing. So like the MK Ultra and with the celebrities is definitely not far fetched. Believe that. Um, also conducted CIA funded drug experiments, which included LSD and a drug called bulbocapine, bulbocapinine. In high doses, bulbocapinine products produces canatonia, and well, they put you in a catatonic state, which means you're just like zoned the fuck out. A statue-like state, which and his associate Heath and his associated Harry Bailey, MD, thought would be useful for controlling violent prisoners. According to one memo, the CIA sought information as whether the drug could cause loss of speech, loss of sensitivity to the brain, loss of memory, loss of power and will, and an increased toxicity in persons with a weak type of central nervous system. They tested the drug exclusively on African American prisoners, whom Bailey routinely referred to as niggers at the Louisiana State Prison. Are we surprised now? Okay. Engineered invisibility. I keep checking how many pages we got. Oh, how many pages do we got? A whole lot. Despite the extensive history of using Black bodies as research subjects, despite the consistently high African American population in prisons, despite the popularity of research studies with racial emphasis, and despite the penchant for using Blacks in the most dangerous or distasteful experiments, jailed African American research subjects remain largely invisible in the medical and popular literature until the 1960s. In his book, Undue Risk, Jonathan Moreno writes that African Americans were usually excluded from earlier prison studies. Ironically, prison research in the United States, including the testicular irradiation research, was generally confined to white men. Because participating in prison research was considered a privilege, it was denied to minorities, at least until the civil rights movement succeeded in equalizing social opportunities for African Americans, including research opportunities. So I don't know what privilege he's talking about, but that's literally a whole lie because two long ass pages ago, we learned something different. So how he a whole scientist, doctor, or whatever, and you're not, you don't even know what the fuck is going on. You ain't heard about no Holmesburg, nothing. You ain't heard about nothing. So get out of here. Um, Even the report of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments discussed in Chapter 9 agreed, noting in 1975, the National Commission carefully examined the racial composition of the research subjects at a prison with a major drug testing program. The commission found that African Americans made up only 31% of the subject population, while this racial minority comprised 68% of the general prison population. Mm. The ACHRE's broad suggestion that blacks were underrepresented in prison medical experimentations is fatally weakened by the fact that the commission looked at only one unnamed prison experiment at one point in time and thus was not representative. But even the straw man ACHRE set up demonstrates the disproportionate use of African Americans in prison research. Black Americans in 1975 constituted only 13% of the US population, so that the 31% utilized in this prison experiment meant that African Americans were subjected to research at a rate that's just under 3 times higher than their presence in the nation's population. The ACHRE looked at this high Black experimentation rate only in comparison to the even higher Black incarceration rate. This was myopic because it looks only at the artificial universe of prison rather than the entire community of African Americans. This is an essentially communitarian fallacy, which means that the analyses have been ignored the most cohesive affected community, the community of African Americans, not the community of prison inmates. Moreover, although scientists' early prison research records were notoriously sloppy and frequently lost, extant records do make I'm sorry, extant records do make specific references to Black prison subjects. Also, those researchers who had a dearth of Black subjects, such as Heller, complained of their frustrations in gaining diverse subjects, more diverse subject population, suggesting that they considered the inclusion of African American prisoners in the research norm. Moreover, various prison studies had different racial compositions, and a few recorded experiments were designed were designed as all white, just as some use only Black or mostly Blacks. Chapter 6 has already described Joseph Goldberg, MD, chose to induce pellagra only in white prison inmates to dramatize that pellagra was not a Black disease, but would strike malnourished whites as well. Other medical experiments were reserved for African Americans, and these were often the most risky and painful, explains Hornblum. At the Holmesburg Prison Complex, where decisions about who participated in particular experiments were often left to inmate assistants. He explains, it is possible that the racism in American culture was reflected in the inmates' decision about who participated in a given test. For example, sorry, not only healthy colored male volunteers were permitted to enroll in a protocol for 1957 Philadelphia experiment to promote the inoculation of human skin within herpes simplex and herpes zoster. What the hell is that? Oh my goodness. I never heard of that in my life. Which were painful, incurable viral infections. However, another Holmesburg experiment, which targeted young white volunteers, required only that they lower an arm in the detergent sodium lauryl sulfate found in many shampoos for only an hour daily for over 55 consecutive days. So they would give black folks the shots and the diseases and shit like that, but then they'll do the topical stuff like soap and detergent on the white folks. Okay. Prison researchers often filed, I'm sorry, I'm kind of stiff. Prison researchers often often veiled the racial composition of their research population for the same reason that Marion Sims once hid the racial composition of his vesi vesicovaginal fistula patients, con- concerned that scientists will appear to exploit powerless black patients. For example, when researchers wrote journal articles about the approximately 15,000 Maryland inmates of state juvenile institutions subjected to genetic tests for XYY syndrome, 85% of whom were Black. They focused upon the mostly white minority focused oh my god, they focus upon the mostly white minority subset of this research program to hide the true racial composition of the experiment, as well as as will be detailed in chapter 11. Perhaps the belief that black prisoners were exempt from early experimentation can best be understood as emanating from such carefully maintained invisibility. Stripped of their freedom, their civil rights, and their family and community connections, Black prison subjects were almost as legally invisible as the slaves in antebellum experiments. Their invisibility was perpetuated in no small measure by the news media, which gave most Americans their only window into prison research. Until the 1970s, the early news coverage of prison research was almost universally laudatory. Researchers and prison administrators welcomed journalists. The, welcomed journalists' determination to celebrate the heroism of criminals who submitted themselves to medical experimentation. New York Times profiles of incarcerated volunteers are all of white men, such as Sing Sing, lifer Louis Boy. Yeah. In 1949, the Times sympathetically chronicled the risky and medically unsustained experiment to which Boy submitted in an attempt to save the life of an 8-year-old cancer boy or 8-year-old cancer ridden girl. Boy lay on a gurney next to the dying girl while their circulatory systems were joined by rubber tubing so that his body could act as a filter for her poisoned blood. The girl died, but Boy survived. A news article strongly suggested that his selfless act helped to expiate his crimes. Mm. The press attention generated intense human interest, culminating in Boy's what is this? Oh, culminating in Boy's Christmas time pardon in Louisiana or in I don't know how I got Louisiana from Illinois, but in Illinois, Statesville inmate Nathan Leopold, excuse me. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I got the glitter on here. I got more glitter on there. This is how I wanted it last time. But I don't know if you can see the sparkles. Like I can see them in this light, but it's dope up close. In Illinois, Statesville inmate Nathan Leopold, half the infamous Leopold and Leo thrill killing duo, had been nefarious had been the nefarious architect of the highly publicized crime of the century, the coolly executed 1924 kidnapping and murder, of 14-year-old Bobby Franks, who which they dispassionately bludgeoned to death and discarded in a marsh on Chicago's South Side. But profiles in New York Times and other newspapers detailed his key role in recruiting other inmates to join malaria experiments and signing inmates up for potentially sight-saving corneal donations. In his memoir, Life Plus 99 Years, Leopold boasted of his prison research roles, and this coverage helped to transform his thrill killer image and boosted his successful parole bid. I'm reading like I'm slow, and I don't know why I am, but I don't know. Maybe I don't like what I'm reading. I'm just being petty. I don't know. Okay, good, good. You can see it. Okay, word. But this approach to inmate subjects had the curious effect of effacing the participation of Black prisoners in medical research from the period between the world wars until the 70s. News accounts do not refer to Black participation, and the images gracing these guys to social redemption are those of white inmates lying on gurneys. In Life's magazine's profile of Dr. Kligman's laboratories in New York Times photos of inmates queued up to give blood or tissue, no discernibly Black bodies ever appear. Black volunteers may have been ignored because physicians were nearly always white males who, when approached for the name of an inmate to profile, proffered a white male for several reasons. The inmate, like Boy and Leopold, would be treated to a laudatory parole. So doctors cited the names of the prisoners whom they thought were worthy of such advantages and whose freedom they could anticipate with comfort, essentially prisoners with whom they could not easily identify. Mainstream journalists, too, were nearly universally white until the 1960s, and they also identify with Leopold's articulateness. Articulateness, intellectual attainments, and socioeconomic economic level in a manner they could never have identified with Jesse Williams. White volunteers were also more likely, like Leopold, to have obtained good education and thus were more likely to find an audience for their memoirs, which, not surprisingly, cast them in the most sympathetic light. Almost most researchers, although some researchers, especially in Southern prison, frank racism also precluded Black medical volunteers from reaping positive publicity. Ah, estamos hablando claro, manera que- Okay, volunteer medical slavery. But Were prisoners black or white really volunteers? In 1947, the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg charged Nazi doctors with war crimes, including experimentation upon prisoners of war. The Germans ably conducted defense hinged upon Dr. Gerhard Rose's contention that U.S. doctors were guilty of exactly the same abuses, regularly subjecting prisoners to dangerous, painful, and voluntary experiments. The trials culminated not only in the conviction and execution of many accused physicians, but also in the Nuremberg Code, which was devised to govern future medical experimentation. The U.S. delegation to the Nuremberg trials included Andrew Ivy, MD, the American Medical Association representative. He offered an idealistic view of American prison research, assuring the public that the highest standards were upheld. Ivy specifically claimed that American prisoners had never been abused or used involuntarily, but he was wrong. But he was wrong. In fact, a mere year after Nuremberg, the Journal of American Association praised the Statesville prison malaria experiments, which violated the Nuremberg proscription against the experimentation by using prisoners. Unfortunately, American researchers have never thought of the code as pertinent to their research. Yale Law School ethicist J. Katz, MD, avers that in the eyes of many American researchers, it was a good code for the barbarians, but an unnecessary code for ordinary physicians. Okay. Think. In the Nazi doctors and the Nuremberg Code, George Annis and Michael Grodin analyzed how U.S. investigators rejected Nuremberg and replaced it with not but hollow assurances that American medical researchers needed no constraints. The Nuremberg Code is also toothless. Nuremberg is also toothless, carrying no penalties for its breach, and so it's widely ignored. Why did she say toothless? I didn't get that part. Uh, the vague, unsustained claims proposed by Ivy stood in opposition to the judgments of all the pertinent medical organizations, which by the end of World War II had already weighed experimentation with prisoners in their ethical balances and found it wasting. Even the specially appointed research committee of the AMA denounced experimentation with prisoners as human rights violations. In 1952, this AMA House In 1952, I'm sorry, y'all, this AMA House of Delegates accordingly issued a resolution entitled Disapproval of Participation. Oh shit, I almost stopped the line. In scientific, oh wait. Yeah, in scientific experiments by inmates of penal institutions. Physicians, universities, or jails could not claim to be unaware of this position because the AMA sent copies of the resolution to governors, state and federal prison officials, and parole boards. Similarly, the Ethical Committee of the World Medical Association in 1961 Code of Ethics on American Experimentation declared persons detained in prison, penitentiaries, or reformatories being captive groups should not be used as subjects of human experiment, nor persons in a position in which they are incapable of exercising the power of free choice. Okay, they finally did something right. Hold on, let me get something right quick. It's 2 seconds, y'all. 2 seconds. Pack a lacking, okay? But I had to stand up and stretch. But none of these prohibitions on medical experimentation with prisoners was ever enforced, so they were blithely ignored by researchers who allowed who were allowed to police themselves. Um, Researchers, wardens, pharmaceutical companies, and universities echo Ivy's claim that prisoners chose to participate voluntarily and even clamored for inclusion in experiments. But they weren't told what was going to happen. They were just looking at the money. That's all. Were prison subjects, black or white, willing, willing volunteers who freely consented to inoculation with deadly infectious diseases and to testing that removed or damaged their skin, hair, and nails? Did they voluntarily submit to castration for a few dollars and the transplantation of animal tissues or cancer cells, as well as exposure to chemical warfare agents and untried psychoactive drugs? I mean, did they volunteer? She's asking. Usually, no. The supposedly free consent of American prisoners was circumscribed in several ways. In the most extreme cases, some prisoners' right to simply say no did not exist. For example, between January and April of 1968, imprisoned subjects at the California Medical Facility were paralyzed with succuline, I don't know how you say that, succinyl, also known as anectine, a neuromuscular compound that paralyzed muscles so that the prisoner could not move or breathe. Many likened the terrifying experience to drowning in fetters. I don't know what fetters are. What are fetters? Do you know what a fetter is? Let's see. I just got that's on the page. Trying to go quick. A chain or it's some type of restraint, typically placed around the ankles. Okay, so it's like drowning with fetters. When the five of the 34 selected, or excuse me, when 5 of the 64 selected prisoners refused to participate in the experiment, the institution's special treatment board gave permission on behalf of the uh, well, they made these thug ass niggas come get them and make them be injected against their will. By prison administrations usually exerted subtler pressure in the form of authority figures, even prisoner advocates, such as social workers who steered penniless inmates to research studies. Former Holmesburg social worker Priscilla Beecroft recalls if somebody didn't have money for the commissary and wasn't on the list for a job, the social worker would say, you could go to the U of P testing operation. Another social worker admitted harboring doubts about the medical studies to which he referred inmates. We questioned it among ourselves, but nobody looked into it. The medical personnel walked around in white coats and looked very official and authoritative. Parole boards exerted considerable pressure as well. The well-publicized releases of volunteers such as Louis Boy, Nathan Leopold, and the 59 survivors of Statesville malaria experiment dangled a tantalizing carrot of freedom before their potential subjects. And we remember how they did that one, the one experiment on the girl who was in prison, said they would release her if they let them do the experiment on her. Although volunteers usually did not receive parole, administrators administrators often placed letters of thank yous or commendations in volunteer files, which might have raised their hopes. But parole boards sometimes exerted strong negative pressure as well, according to inmates such as Nick Displodo of Arizona. I'm just going to call him Nick in the Arizona State Prison, who claimed in a New York Times article that parole boards routinely held a refusal to participate in research against inmates seeking release from his institution. The prisoner's ability to consent freely was also compromised by a lack of essential information. Informed consent and mandatory Informed consent is mandatory for research subjects in all venues, but researchers often did not divulge the true nature of the risk and often did not even explain the actual nature of the experiments. A New York Times expose of the multi prison debacle by Dr. Austin Stowe, mentioned earlier, reveals that there was no informed consent and that no accurate records were kept. Some researchers who claim to have consent forms could not produce them. Jesse Williams, veteran of scores of experiments, has repeatedly insisted, I was never given a consent form. I never saw a consent form. Consent forms made sporadic appearances in prison research, but the average Black prisoner was poorly educated or even illiterate. So even when so even when presented with a consent form, he was likely to be he was unlikely to be able to read or understand it. Former Black inmate Edward Anthony, for example, insists that he had no idea that researchers meant by terms such as toxicity or efficiency. Consent forms often were so vague, misleading, and replete with technical data and scientific language that the physicians themselves could not understand them. Although consent forms made only sporadic appearances, legal releases were they happened sometimes. Lots of men were burned, scarred, and wanted to sue, but they had signed these releases waivers and thought they couldn't. Recalls white former Philadelphia inmate Alzala. I don't know how to say his name. Investigators went to remarkable lengths to deceive inmates about the harms inherent in the test. Jesse Williams spoke of participating in what had been described to him as footwear experiment, in which he had to wear boots taped to his feet nonstop for a week. This actually was an experimental attempt to uh, induce a hard to eradicate foot fungus. When white inmate Jay Boys worked as a laboratory assistant, doctors suggested that to allay inmates' fear about the test safety, Boyce affixed cotton balls and dummy patches to his own back and arms in order to heighten the deception. The doctors even paid Boyce as if he were a participant. So they had this white boy basically lying and taping cotton balls to his back as though he was being experimented on, but not really doing it. Prisoners at Holmesburg were often reassured that the shampoo or lotions that were tested on them were perfectly safe and could cause only minor irritation. 30 to 50 years later, the men remain bald, scarred, and suffer skin and internal organ damage. But what of other volunteers? Those who were neither physically forced or no, nor strongly guided by prison administration. When they participated, they offer themselves up voluntarily? The answer hinges upon the meaning of voluntary. Copious evidence exists that coercion was the key element of the supposed given consent by the African American prisoners. Today's clinical medical ethicists tend to define coercion in medical research very narrowly and without much precision. So many would argue that the inmates may have been induced but were not coerced. However, such critics fail to take into account the coercive features of the prison special environment. The hell of prison life made the research laboratory feared and abhorred by African Americans on the outside, an irresistible haven, even a life support unit for the African American prisoner. Man, so it looked so the way they presented it was hella. So they was like, I would rather do this than just be fucking locked. Except for, and then you get money too. Except for a few memoirs by famous inmates such as Leopold, the description of the inmates' motives for voluntary emanated from the researchers and prison administrators. They agreed that inmates were motivated by money with which they could purchase items such as cigarettes, radios, and meager delicacies of commissary. Researchers also sometimes noted for the press that prisoners enjoyed the special amenities of the prison ward, such as more frequent showers, better meals, and calmer, more secure surroundings. I bet because they already been fucked up and tortured all day. The new media unquestionably, excuse me, The news media unquestioningly echoed the supposed motivations, subtly sabotaging images of inmate heroism. But researchers and prison administrators were hardly disinterested observers, and they did not tell everything they knew about prisoners' true motives. Being admitted to the research unit allowed the inmate to avoid the legion of institutional predators. A stint in the lab offered a respite from the ever present threat of gang rape, shakedowns, racial strife from prison gangs, and deadly assaults for a thousand petty slights. Taking meals in the laboratory unit allowed the subject to escape the mess hall and the dreaded sight of frequent melees and stabbings. The inmates did speak with relish of the better meals and the calmer atmosphere of the research laboratory and freely acknowledged their need for money. There is no question that men participated for $300 to $400 a month, up to $1,500 per experiment they could earn, because the few dollars a week the unskilled could earn in the prison laundry or kitchen offered no competition. But a cultural dissonance separated the hostile, violent chaos of the inmates' world and the benign, orderly environment of the university researcher or journalist. Okay, so they're saying, just like in the other page, some of the inmates and they didn't want to fuck around with getting fucking raped or stabbed, poked up, or let me get your you gonna eat your cornbread and all that ill shit. Where they get to go to a nice, quiet laboratory where it's all professional and shit like that. So hell yeah, they get money too, but they wasn't told what was gonna be done to them. You know what I'm saying? They see these white coats and you think you could trust them. You know what I'm saying? Because a few dollars. Money had a very different meaning for inmates than it had for outsiders. Inmates sought not only commissary baubles and delicacies to brighten life, but more important, the price of freedom or at least of safety. Uh, Poverty, not criminal behavior, is the most common feature of the imprisoned. Jails are full of people, both guilty and innocent, who are who are there only because they are too poor to make bail. By the 1970s, most prisoners in Holmesburg, for example, were legally innocent men awaiting trial. Between the 1940s and 1970s, bail bombing typically would spring an inmate for a down payment of 10% of his bail so that a man jailed in lieu of a $500 bond could buy his freedom within weeks with the $50 he earned from a single medical experiment. Several inmates also mentioned a motivation about which the news media kept silent. The human landscape of prison is largely devoid of affection, and incarcerated men describe time in research laboratory as a respite for the psyche, a place where one could go for a while to be addressed and touched with kindness, dignity, and concern. Oh my God, that's sad. So, I mean, that is so ill that they, at the time, they don't even really know what's going on. They just getting these experiments on them, and they're thinking of that as like kind and attention and affection. That's really sad. That lets you know how harsh the conditions are in prison. If somebody would rather go to a laboratory and get experimented on than be in the hells of the prison system. That lets you know right motherfucking there. Damn, man, this makes me think of my brother. Um, damn, that just made me sad. That just made me sad. Um, Several inmates also mention a motivation by which the new. Oh, no, no, I already read that part. Researchers such as Kligman knew this, and he imparted the knowledge to medical proteges during lectures. And I think this is one of his quotes. Many of the prisoners, for the first time in their lives, find themselves in the role of important human beings. We say to them, "You are important. We need you." Once this once this is established, those guys will knock their brains out to please you. If the experiment does not pan out, they get depressed. They become emotionally involved with the projects. The capacity to respond to love is greater than most people realize. I feel almost like a scoundrel, like Machiavelli, because of what I can do them. You are a scoundrel, a scoundrel. You're the miscreant. You're the deceitful miscreant. You're the thug. You're the monster. You're the lunatic. You know what I'm saying? Not the guy who held up the convenience store for the money and didn't hurt nobody. I mean, I'm not saying it's okay, and I'm not encouraging it, but you're in a position uh, uh, of where you're good to go. They're a meager, they don't have anything. You know what I'm saying? Solomon McBride, Dr. Kligman's chief scientific assistant, was African American. Although he had no formal education in pharmacology, Acres of Skin describes how he managed the Holmesburg testing program on a daily basis for 20 years, once again illustrating how some blacks participated in experimental injuries to black subjects. However, McBride described the studies as non-invasive procedures and claimed nobody was injured in those tests. When confronted about the lifelong injuries to the inmates, he denied knowledge of such practices. Wow, that's ill. I wasn't aware of that. I don't think it ever happened. When asked about the use of radioactive isotopes, he is quick to respond, "No, that wasn't done. I don't think the prison would permit it." Informed that documents from the Atomic Energy Commission verified the use of isotopes at Holmesburg, he admits, "I heard about it, but I don't know anything about it. I was opposed to things that were not kosher. If I saw something wrong, I tell them to stop. I told the residents not to do stuff that was dangerous. If they hurt those black brothers, I wouldn't let them do it." Mm, that's all I got to say about that. Despite McBride's denials, Holmesburg prisoners suffered psychiatric damage, and physical injuries that crippled them for life. Many inmates believed that the research physicians had sown the seeds of deadly cancers during the time in the laboratory, but this claim cannot be proven because inmates do not know to what they were exposed. Inmates who also volunteered for experiments because the laboratory was often the inmate's sole point of entry to medical care, which was sketchy. On the evenings and weekends, medical staff were often simply unavailable, and guards or even trusted inmates performed triage on a sick call model, assessing who was ill, who was malingering, and who was sick enough to justify the inconvenience of arranging transport to distant medical care. Continuous medical care, such as quality cancer chemotherapy and regular diabetes maintenance, apart from blood glucose drugs, were simply unavailable. Wow, that's ill. Okay, prison purge research. So I think this is the last part of the chapter. By the 1970s, research in prisons began to disappear, succumbing to scandals that unmasked the racially unbalanced, abusive, dangerous, and scientifically sloppy nature of the experimentation with prisoners. The exploitation of large numbers of black male prisoners caused public relations problems for researchers and institutions in the wake of the increasingly violent and bitter civil rights battles and the revelations of the syphilis study at Tuskegee. The thi- Thyla iomide scandal, in which thousands of deformed children were born to European women who took the poorly tested drug, was another important catalyst in tainting the American perception of medical research. Furthermore, Harvard researcher Henry K. Beecher, MD, had published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that criticized 22 cases of exploitative experimentation. An early version of the article had detailed 50 abusive cases. The journal was able to induce Dr. Beecher not to identify the physicians, but the pharmaceutical industry feared that next time a researcher of Beecher's status might name names. The very next year, British physician Maurice Papworth did so. Why are they named so crunchy and stupid? To trade their health. Yeah, no. But I mean when you're like destitute, you don't know how to read, you don't know how to write. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. The formerly news media delivered the coup de grace by thrusting researcher after researcher into harsh light of public exposure. On July 29, 1969, the New York Times published a page one article that exposed Dr. Austin Stoll's ethnically and scientifically sloppy drug testing program, which had crippled and killed unknown numbers of men throughout the state prison of Alabama. Unlike the earlier articles, which had praised the experiments, this account suggested that most of his victims were Black. In the 1970s, the Washington Star exposed the use of approximately 15,000 Black boys in the Maryland Juvenile Institution in the XYY experiments. These are further described in Chapter 11. So that's what we're about to read about on Wednesday. The malaria experiments that had been lauded as daring a few decades earlier were roundly condemned in the mid 70s as deadly. Some of the bittersweet oh shit, sorry. Some of the bitterest prison battles were physical as well as verbal, causing the most almost universal white investigators to fear for their safety. Dr. Sigmund Weitzman described being slammed against the wall by a 6 foot 4 inch, 230 pound Roy Tiger Williams, a black inmate at Holmesburg who had lost his hair after testing a shampoo formulation. I was scared to death. He threatened to kill me. Physicians grew frightened of the work with the increasingly distrustful inmates and felt intimidated by the growing influence of Black Muslims who cast a jaundiced eye on prison experimentation. I know that's right. Bert Kahn, MD, who worked at Holmesburg Prison from 1959 to 65, said he left in part because he feared for his personal safety. I became concerned about the growth of the Muslim movement. The deaths of 29 inmates and 11 white authority figures in 71. Attica prison riot almost sent a chill through prison medical research programs. I bet it did. You was about to keep playing with them to death. Such programs suffered legal repercussions, repercussions, as well as adequate inmates won damages for suffering ill treatment and assaults. In 79, nine Oregon prison subjects shared over $2,000 in damages. When a lawsuit by one medical experimentation victim at Holmesburg Prison resulted in a monetary settlement whose terms are confidential. Other pharmaceutical company researchers realized that they too could become targets of successful inmate legal action. Charles Miller, a prison research administrator for pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly, lamented, the reason we closed the doggone thing down was that we were getting too much hassle and heat from the press. It just didn't seem worth it. A January 1973 Atlantic Monthly cover story by investigating journalist Jessica Mitterford proved even more powerful. She explained that prison medical research consisted of exploitation of the lowest, most vulnerable classes by the member of the most privileged. The article became a chapter in her book, Cheaper Than Chimpanzees. And you remember Kleidman, or was it the other guy that said that? Um, her book, Kind and Unusual Punishment, a dissection of the U.S. prison system. Soon afterward, Senator Edward Kennedy held hearings that led to the National Commission for the Protection of the Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which investigated medical experimentation on prisoners. It considered banning such research outright, and most other Western industrialized countries had done decades earlier. Despite headlines such as government to ban medical research on federal inmates, it decided against this in 1976, partly because not only pharmaceutical companies, but also many prisoners opposed a ban. Inmates wanted that money, wished to have the opportunity to participate for several reasons. They could make real money no other way. They sometimes could obtain health care no other way. And they missed the safety and amenities of the research laboratory. And they wanted to feel they were contributing to society. Damn, man, isn't that ill? In 1979, the state prison of Southern Michigan inmates even filed suit to prevent the FDA from excluding them from research studies. Oh, that's interesting. Instead of banning prison research outright, the CPBBR proposed a detailed accreditation scheme that the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, in consultation with the American Correctional Association, rejected as impractical. In 78, HEW produced stringent human experimentation regulations, which remain in effect today. So did the CPBR in 79's report. known to the Belmont Report, which placed the onus on researchers for ensuring that research with prisoners provides informed consent and is therapeutic under what is called common rule. The common rule sets strict limits on non-therapeutic research and research done with prisoners and requires the review of proposed studies by institutional review boards. No study in a prison can present more than a minimal risk to the inmate. Okay, that's right. In some, there remains four types of permissible prison research that on the cause and effect of incarceration and crime. The study of prison or incarcerated person. Huh? I'm live. Okay. Incarcerated persons, investigations of conditions that affect prisoners in mass, and therapeutic studies. And therapeutic studies. I'm running through all these periods. I'm trying to get done with this chapter. Sorry, y'all. Okay. Uh-uh. Okay. In some, there remain four types of permissible prison research that on the cause and effect of incarceration and crime. The study of prisons or incarcerated persons, investigations of conditions that affect prisoners in mass, and therapeutic studies. Although these reforms were necessary and laudable, they are imperfect, especially because the language is vague. What, for example, constitutes minimal risk? Even the definition of therapeutic research has come into question. Still, research at most prisons, including Holmesburg, ceased by 76 and result of public outrage and lawsuit. Almost done shit. Most people don't realize that prison medical research, which all but died out in the 70s, is enjoying a quiet renaissance. Since the late 80s, investigators in Arkansas, Maryland, South Carolina, Texas, Florida, Connecticut, Rhode Island have all been conducting and proposing research in prisons. Even more crucial to understand than the past of exploitation of African Americans in prisons is the future medical use and possible abuse of African Americans because they are the single fastest growing group in the prison population. Today, research with prisoners means research with blacks because in 2004, African Americans constituted 44 to 46% of all prisoners, which is almost four times their proportion of the general population. Clearly, prison experimental abuse is likely to affect American disproportionately, or African Americans disproportionately, thanks in large part to the mandatory sentencing for drug infractions. Women are not spared. Black women make up the fastest growing population in American prisons. The HIV pandemic and more recently recognized hepatitis C epidemic have attacked federal dollars and the support of pharmaceutical companies. This has renewed the interest in prisoners as subjects because 17% of the incarcerated have HIV, six times the because most HIV positive people in the United States, in the U.S. prisons, are Black. The question of HIV research in prisons is a question of Blacks being used in such research. For hepatitis C, the statistics are even more dire. Inmates have the highest hepatitis C infection rate in the country. 2% of all Americans, but 20% of inmates are infected. For imprisoned Black men, hepatitis C infection rate is much high as 60%. Where prison research today is not restricted to these elements. Because inmates suffering from disorders ranging from asthma to cancer have attracted the attention of U.S. researchers who are conducting 10,000 biomedical research programs. Most of these research are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, which, for example, supports the Yale School of Medicine medical research 191 million In 1999, Brown University researchers mounted a lawsuit to gain access to the prisons for HIV research. They cited the high rates of HIV and other infectious diseases in prisons and the need of inmates for cutting edge treatments. How do we know they're not experimenting on them too, though? Their desire to do research as a plea for therapy. They are correct in pointing out that too little attention has been paid to prisoners' health. As early as 1962, physicians complained of a dearth of medical care and therapeutic research aimed at prisoners' ills. But why, if securing badly needed AIDS, TB, and hepatitis C therapy is the goal, do proposed prison medical programs focus upon the the theoretical benefits of research rather than on the known demonstrated benefits of the best available therapy? Few gentlemen receive standard care for AIDS and hepatitis, such as protease inhibitors, HA, heart therapy, HHRT, heart therapy, or interferon, interferon for Hep C. Prisons has even failed to take simple public health measures to reduce high incidence of anal rape and blood-borne contamination and to restore infectious disease control to prisons, which would also seem to be a cornerstone of any HIV or Hep C or TB eradication policy. Brown University researchers have conflated HIV treatment and experimentation, leading one to question whether the real concern is for prisoners' health or rather researchers wish to resume the lucrative jailhouse research of yesterday. The pharmaceutical industry requires research with humans, and the nation's 45,000 researchers are hungrily eyeing the 2 million Americans behind bars. Today, arguments are over the ethical codes have been replaced by utilitarian rationales focusing upon the medical benefits to society and invoking the vague right of prisoners to experimentation. But is is prison research, which will take place disproportionately with African Americans, really likely to focus on therapy and no benefit from prisoners? Right. Or will experimental treatments again expose prisoners to dangerous, illegal medical risks? Despite the federal despite the federal regulations, perhaps the best indication of research actual intentions is a glance at some current protocols for research initiatives in American prisons. Researchers are currently conducting studies that involve inducing labor in pregnant inmates. Oh my God. Testing different methods of obtaining biopsies, conducting a clinical trial of experimental HIV vaccine. Oh no, testing delivery of a potent new cancer chemotherapy agent directly into the liver. Oh my God. And artificially inducing hypothermia to treat lung cancer. Oh my God. They are really like playing games with these people. At St. Petersburg Times report offered direct evidence that some of the therapeutic HIV approaches with HIV positive inmates not be centered on the inmate's need for therapy because participating inmates complained that they felt coerced to participate in such studies and agreed to do so only in order to escape poor medical care, abusive conditions, and a lack of access to up-to-date HIV drugs at other Florida prisons. One particularly troubling study among those mentioned above is Dr. Joseph Schweichenberger's radical new approach to lung cancer, which is to heat the subject's blood to a temperature where the errant cancer cells theoretically could not survive. To test his theory, he sedates inmates and connects them to a machine called the biologic HT system, which removes blood via venous in cervical tubes. The blood is heated, then returned to the inmate's body, which is kept at very dangerously elevated temperature of 108.5 degrees. Any adult taken to the hospital with a temperature of 105 would be considered an emergency case, and cooling strategies will be immediately undertaken. But Schwarzenberger's protocol, inmates at 108.5 temperatures are sustained for 2 hours. Subjects sign a consent form that lists deaths, seizures, congestive heart failure, burns, heart attack, and limb loss as possible complications, even if the subjects are in a late stage of lung cancer, where the cancer rates are infinite, infinite, infinite infinitesimal. I don't know what that means. This doesn't excuse such a risky procedure, although putatively therapeutic. This research surely poses greater than minimal risk. The consent form includes a waiver that states, I understand I cannot receive financial uh, re- remuneration for any injuries resulting from my participation in this project. However, the law specifically prohibits language in an informed consent document that appears to waive a subject's right to release an investigator from liability or negligence or assault. In July 2000, the Office of Human Research Protection suspended 300 studies by the University of Texas medical branch in Galveston, including Schwarzenberger's, after the researchers flouted federal regulations. 195 of these studies, mostly HIV and AIDS trials, were conducted in prisons, according to the Austin American Statesman. In in September 14, 2000, le- um, in a September 14, 2000's letter, the OHRP listed numerous university research projects conducted outside of the permissible categories for prison research and cited scant evidence that Galveston's Institutional Review Board had adhered to federal law. The OHRP had approved more than 400 federally funded studies with prisoners since 2000, but when it froze the University of Texas research projects, a chill once again crept over the prison's research. However, now the inmate population has leapt from 200,000 in the 70s to 2 million. Researchers once again seek entrance to prisons, wishing to undertake a wider range of medical studies. Wow. The Institute of Medicine, which provides the federal government guidance on biomedical issues, has appointed the Committee on Ethical Considerations for the Protection of Prisoners involved in research to study the issue. It is headed by the brilliant public health law scholar Lawrence O. Gostin, JD, professional and director of the Center for Law and the Public's Health at Johns Hopkins and Georgetown Universities. The committee will determine whether it is possible to ensure true informed consent in prisons, and whether research on prisoners should be confined to the therapeutic realm. As this book will as this book went to press in late 2006, Gostin's group was still weighing the relaxation of the regulations that have been muted medical research in prisons since the 70s, and decisions may result in dramatic modification of prison research policy as early as 2007. If the doors are flung wide open to investigators, will they admit in therapy or exploitation? How can we best protect sick prisoners, many of whom are Black, from abusive research without completely banning prison research? As early as 1999, Anne DeGrue MD suggested that the best way to give prisoners with AIDS access to cutting edge clinical studies while protecting them from abuse is to ensure that the research is done only in prisons that already provide high quality medical care. This way, prisoners can participate in research without feeling forced into trials. However, this chapter has demonstrated that the laws enacted to protect prisoners' rights and health consistently have failed to do so. There are no guarantees that today's promises of humane therapeutic research, which often conflates research and care, will protect inmates more effectively. Until American medicine achieves a better record of providing care while avoiding abuse, an utter ban on prison research may be the only protection. However, prisoners are not only a group of African Americans who live with the threat of being involuntarily subjected to research in the name of therapy. The next chapter chronicles the plight of Black children who are forced into service as experimental subjects. So that's what we're going to get into on Wednesday. Well, I don't know. It sounds like to me they're injecting them with shit. And with that HIV shit, I wouldn't be surprised if they were squeezing them up with it. But look though, it's 10 o'clock. I had to blast through that chapter because I didn't feel like I was gonna make it. So I'm not gonna linger around too much because we gotta read the Coldest Winter Ever tomorrow, which is an easy and a very fun read. So I look forward to seeing you there tomorrow, and I'm out. So please share if you care, share if you dare. I know my Care Bears will. Thank you so much. I had to. So share if you care. Please share, share, share. And I'll see y'all tomorrow. Peace. Oh, and watch my other videos. I uploaded some today. All right, I'm out.